Are you someone that's getting stronger in the gym every week, but you're not getting bigger and you're confused because people have told you your whole life that progressive overload is king? Well, if you are, this is going to be the video for you. I'm going to give you 5 reasons why that might be happening and what you can do about it. So the first 3 reasons are going to be a little bit more obvious, and the last 2 reasons are going to be a little bit more nuanced and maybe something you haven't considered. But if you're someone who maybe hasn't considered any of these things, then I think all this is going to be helpful to you. So the number 1 reason that you're getting stronger but not bigger is this word with 4 letters, and it's called food. Food. Have you ever heard someone who's like, I'm eating so little food, I'm eating so low calories every single day, and yet I'm not losing weight, like why is that? And then you ask them, hey, like, have you actually tried tracking your food? And they're like, no, what do you mean? Like, why would I need to do that? Similar situation here, but just flip it around. A lot of people think they're eating a lot, but once they track their calories, they realize that they're either at maintenance or perhaps even below maintenance, right? And they're losing weight. And unless you're a total beginner and or someone who is going to make use of pharmacology, this is probably the most important thing in tandem with the next 2 things. So make sure you're eating your food. It sounds obvious, but this is the number 1 thing that people are not doing, to be honest. Now, number 2 is effort. And when I say effort, I mean lower relative effort. So if you've heard of RIR as a scale, reps in reserve, it basically means that, if I have 5 RIR at the end of a set, it means I could have done 5 more reps. I had 5 in the tank. If I had 0 RIR, 0 reps in reserve, I couldn't have done 1 more. Now, the hypertrophy sort of RIR range in all likelihood is probably between 0 and 2, meaning by the time you get done with your set, you should at least be sort of slowing down in the set. You don't need to do every set to failure, and this is sort of a different conversation, but what you should optimally be doing at the end of every set is there should at least be some struggle, some sort of burning happening. And a lot of people who are getting stronger because of the fact that their efforts are lower. Think about the strongest people on the planet, right? They're obviously pushing their bodies very hard because they're lifting really, really heavy loads, but powerlifters train as if failure is never an option. In other words, if you watch high-level powerlifters train, they'll do like a single, and it'll apparently look like the single, whether it's squat, bench, or deadlift, is just gonna fly off their chest, or they're gonna fly out of the bottom of the hole. And a lot of times, of course, there's some struggle and there's nuance to that conversation, but powerlifters are staying pretty far away from failure. And so people look at those people and they assume that, oh, because these people, they're not really struggling toward the end of their sets, therefore I should also do that if I'm trying to get bigger, because if I get stronger, then I'll get bigger. Right? That's kind of where things get very jumbled and very confusing for people, because if your efforts on average are relatively lower, you're probably going to be able to sustain and continue to build strength, because after a certain point, strength is just a process of learning and relearning and learning and relearning with new loads. So we're going to talk about why this matters in a couple of steps in sort of a different way. But number 3 is going to be low volume. So this sort of pairs with number 2 in the sense that both of these lead. So if I say lower effort and lower volume, that will lead to lower fatigue. And if any of you have powerlifted before, you will know that low fatigued states allow for the appearance of more strength, right? When you are less fatigued, when you're not sore, when you're feeling energized, you can lift more weights. But again, if you are stuck in this cycle of relatively lower efforts, none of your sets are even close to failure, and you're not doing that much volume in tandem with that, those 2 things are going to create a very low fatigue state, which people think, just in terms of the way they feel, is a good thing, right? Going into the gym, oh, I'm pumped, I'm excited, I'm energized, but then you're not making progress. You're getting stronger, but you're not getting bigger, right? And if that is the case, and if that's you, I would look at these 2 variables in addition to number 1, obviously, all at the same time. Take a really good, hard, clear look at where on the spectrum of these you are. Because if you constantly feel like super high energy going into the gym, I know this is somewhat of a controversial thing to say, it's probably likely that you're not training super hard. Like if you have like just an enormous amount of energy and excitement every day you're going into your lift, I have a tough time believing that you're someone that is training to high states of fatigue and therefore potentially higher amounts of progress. All right, so 4 and 5 are going to be a little bit more nuanced, and these are the ones I'm more excited about, to be honest. And number 4 on this list basically relates almost in some weird sense to the powerlifting conversation that we had earlier, which is that people stop learning, okay? Here's what I mean by this. Whenever you are doing an exercise, right? Let's say it's week 1 of an exercise, and let's just imagine that it's a new exercise for you. You either haven't done it in a while or you've never done it. There's gonna be that initial like couple weeks, 3-4 weeks even maybe, where you're just progressing in load effortlessly. Like every single week you're maybe adding 10% load, which is, especially if you've been training for a long time, it's a very high amount of load to add. And that initial sort of learning phase is your body figuring out the motion. But what happens is people, once they are past that phase, they see the progress slow down, as it naturally does. And then every time they add a smaller increment of weight, which will inevitably happen, they stop imagining that every single time they add load is an opportunity to continue to relearn that exercise. And what this results in is basically what I can put simply as change in technique. So for example, on week 1, you're doing biceps curls, you do the 25s, you do 10 reps, you're at failure, great. The next week, maybe you do 30s because the week prior was, your first time doing the dumbbell curl in a while. But then over time, what starts to happen is you stop sort of giving respect to the exercise when you add load. And so in order to add load, what you do is you just, let's say something like you start tossing the weight with your spine or your hips or your knees or all of those things. And so the load in your hand is going up, but the stimulus to your biceps may actually be going down relative to that first week when you had really good, really strict technique in relation to training the biceps. So this idea that learning stops in the first 2 to 4 weeks, I think is totally wrong. And assuming that learning stops within the first 2 to 4 weeks is something that prevents people from actually maintaining and sustaining good technique as the load increases. And in my personal experience, when people really put a hyper focus on this, the size, the strength, assuming that all these things are in check, come along for the ride. So the short hand version of number 4 is treat every single week as if it is an opportunity to relearn the motion. Because guess what? If last week you did 100 pounds on an exercise and this week you did 105, that's a new exercise. That is, if you've never done that before, that is something that is unfamiliar to your body that your body needs to learn. So get rid of this idea that it's just the first month or so of an exercise where you're learning, right? Learn every single week, relearn every single week so that you're not just distributing the stress to all different kinds of tissues and moving it away from what you had as the original technique and the original goal. All right, so one more, and number 5 here is the classic exercise, and this is gonna relate to number 4, exercise hopping. So many of you have probably heard this, but exercise hopping is basically the phenomenon wherein someone will do an exercise maybe a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months. I mean, 2 months is a decent amount of time, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not that long. And they'll get bored of an exercise pretty quickly. So on week 1, they do pec fly, and then on week 2, they do cable chest fly. And while you might be able to, just if you're, a really experienced trainee, really sort of hone in the technique very quickly, what's ultimately going to happen is you're going to have this initial learning phase, right? Which, as we mentioned, constantly sort of continues along for, in essence forever. But you have this learning phase initially where the load is going to increase really quickly. But then what starts to happen is once that load levels off, right? Like here's the increase in load on week 1, week 2, week 3, and then it kind of goes like this. And then it's basically like an imperceivable amount of load that you can add every single week past a certain point. This is maybe 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks or something. And once people get to this point, right, this sort of plateau, which is really just small, very incremental baby steps and load upward, they get bored, they get upset, they're like, oh, I'm no longer progressing as fast, so they switch exercises. And what happens? Well, I do a new exercise. Where am I at again? I'm at this initial phase. So I'm getting stronger, I'm continually adding load to the things that I'm doing, but I'm not actually getting to a point where that load progression slows down. And so I'm therefore not ever going to really be at a point in any exercise if I'm hopping all over the place on everything where I'm using loads that are appropriate to the amount of tissue and strength that I currently have, right? Because we all know that this phase in some ways is kind of a lie. You come out of it and you're like, all right, here's where I'm really at and here's where I'm going to be able to chip away at things. And that's the point where the progress is really going to happen. And so all of these, of course, these second two are more like exercise mechanics specific as opposed to these first three things. But these two things, I think, in terms of a generalized framework, are incredibly, incredibly helpful, not only just to sustain progress, to sustain strength increases incrementally over time, but also just to do things like keep your joints healthy, right? Maintaining a focus on learning, not allowing your ego to sort of encourage you to lift more than you should be lifting in any given scenario, not exercise hopping and basically spending all this time in the gym to no avail just because it's more exciting. I think that can also have carryovers to other, areas of life where maybe you know that you should be doing this one thing, but it's kind of boring. It's kind of like just the daily in and out thing. And so you're constantly hopping between tasks, never really honing in on the thing that you know is going to sort of drive you forward. So I hope these 5 things were helpful. If you have any more, please leave a comment. I would love to hear all of your thoughts on any of this.